Hello, everyone. Welcome all to a Black Architecture Aesthetic panel discussion. My name is Opalia Meade, and I am one of the co-founders of Design in Color. Design in Color is a collective of architects and designers of culture. Our mission aims to diversify the way that architecture is taught and practiced to amplify marginalized communities who've been historically silenced and erased throughout the design process. I'm super excited for today's discussion. We will be opening up the floor to a Q&A at the end of the panel and would love for you all to share your insights, experience, and thoughts in the chats. We welcome you all into this safe space and are honored to have such a lovely lineup of panelists. Today's panelists include Demar Matthews. Demar is a Los Angeles-based architectural designer, theorist, and writer. He is the founder and principal of OffTop Design. He was awarded the Graduate Thesis Prize at Woodbury University for his project, Black Architecture, Unearthing the Black Aesthetic. His introduction to the field was through his article, A Black Architecture Education Experience, or an archinect. Demar believes architecture and good design should not only be for the privileged. Thank you, Demar, for being here. Our next panelist is Ntokozo Mushungo. Ntokozo is a Corbett award-winning design architect who possesses the artistic flair needed to develop and build future landmark architecture in Africa. A natural-born leader and a creative, she has over 10 years of experience working in the development, design, and construction industry in South Africa and Mauritius. She believes that when used effectively, design and architecture can be an instrument of social change and economic inclusion for previously disadvantaged communities. Welcome, Ntokozo. And finally, we have Wandale Tiane. Wandale is an Obama leader, TEDx fellow, architectural designer, social entrepreneur, and the founder and CEO of Ubuntu Design Group. Ubuntu Design Group is an architectural organization that focuses on social impact design projects ranging from individual housing to urban scale design. Influenced by his childhood experiences growing up in post-apartheid South Africa, Wandale founded Ubuntu on the core idea that if apartheid architecture could be used to segregate and oppress, then community-led design should be able to liberate and enable opportunities for all. So Design in Color welcomes our lovely panelists. We are honored to host space with you all. Here at Design in Color, we use a couple of terms that I would like you all to keep in mind during this discussion. One being racialized architecture, which we define as the spatial form of white supremacy. The second term is sacred space, where at Design in Color, we define as a space that successfully allows safe moments to happen that respect and celebrate emotional, intellectual, and spiritual values. So with those two terms in mind, I'd like to open up the floor to the panelists to really, tell us who they are, how they would explain themselves. And Demar, if you don't mind starting.
Hey everybody, my name is Demar Matthews. To describe myself, I'm not sure. I am from Moreno Valley, so not far outside of LA, graduate of Lincoln University, the first degree granting HBCU, pretty recent graduate. And yeah, I'm the founder and principal of OffTop Design.
Perfect. Ntokozo, if you go next.
Hi, everybody. My name is Ntokozo. As Opalia has introduced me, I'm from South Africa. I'm an architect practicing in South Africa. I currently work for Aya Urban Design, which is the sort of exclusive residential and commercial design company. We also are very big on the urban planning side of things. I graduated from Wits University. I graduated at the top of my class for design, so I'm really passionate about designing and just like the craft of architecture, I think is what I enjoy the most. I'm really excited to be here with you guys, and I hope I can share my opinion. Like I mentioned earlier, we're no experts, but we can just speak from our experience and voice our opinions about certain things. And hopefully everyone's open to that kind of discussion.
Perfect. Thank you. Wandale?
Hi, everyone. My name is Wandile Mtiane. I am from Durban, South Africa. I run an architectural organization, social impact, called the Ubuntu Design Group. I work with Nantozo on different social impact work. And yeah, I recently started something really cool. I guess I'm now the founder of something called the Anti-Racist Hot Dog. Uh, that that sort of came out of an incident where I, you know, got kicked out of a exclusionary uh, restaurant club by the beach. So when I wrote an article comparing that to apartheid in South Africa, a lady uh, fiercely commented on Facebook saying, "If you don't like our restaurant, why don't you just start your own?" So I thought that was actually a really good idea. So we're launching the anti-racist hot dog on top of that racist restaurant by the beach promenade. So really exciting stuff. Happy to be here.
I love it. That's the perfect amount of petty, and I'm here for it 100%. So thank you all for giving your introductions. We're going to get started, but as I introduce this next section, I'm going to share my screen and show an image that I want you all to keep in mind as we proceed. Can you all see my screen? A truly Afrofuturist world is one built on an influential past. This past does not need to be Eurocentric, but rather revels in its Afrofuturistic standards and precedents. Its venerated sculptures, arts, and buildings are now steeped in African culture. The Empire State Building is reimagined, now a stunning Nubian-inspired palace of commerce. It holds the same impact as the new Golden Gate Bridge, adorned in Adinkra and Kente. One such example is Olukan Jefoyus's The Frozen Neighborhoods, which is the image shown. The Frozen Neighborhoods by Olukan Jefoyus envisions an alternative future for the Crown Heights neighborhood in New York. He imagined a future where the environment was so bad, humans needed to have movement credits to circulate between cities. The rich scooped up most of these credits, so the marginalized were left to reimagine their immediate environments. Throughout the United States, communities of colors continue to be some of the worst affected by environmental pollution and climate change. Environmental racism refers to the many ways these communities are put at risk through factors ranging from exposure to air pollution and industrial waste to the disproportionate impact of natural disasters like hurricanes. Confronting environmental racism is at the forefront of Olukan's work. Olukan's project explores Crown Heights, a rapidly gentrifying neighborhood in Brooklyn, New York, and imagines an alternative reality where the community has become a frozen zone, cut off from the rest of the city. Despite its isolation, this neighborhood develops robust systems, technologies, and sustainable practices that reshapes people's lives. For Olukan, speculative fiction allows him the flexibility to examine contemporary issues, but creates new parameters for exploring them. In this case, a neighborhood where Black people are safe and have their needs met. In this world, storefront churches become seated vaults and farmers markets. Black coders transform the subway system into kiosks where people can engage in virtual travel, take online courses, or even get job training. So as we begin to get into our conversation, I want you guys to put on your Afrofuturistic hats and really think through the lens of how can we reimagine architecture and design through an Afrofuturistic with the influence of African culture. So we will begin the question segment. And I really want to start off with asking our panelists, what was your personal definition of a Black architecture aesthetic, and what has been your experience with it? And anyone can start.
So my definition of a Black architectural characteristic is an architecture or built environment or object even that is designed purely, or I guess inspired purely from Black things, whether that's Black culture, Black traditions, values, beliefs, shared experience, dance, all these things that are kind of intrinsically Black in America, at least. I only say that because that's the Black I know. So I think if we look at a building right now, it's going to be rare that we can kind of see a Black characteristic and can see ourselves in that building, which is unlike most other cultures. If you go into a Black neighborhood, it's not defined by the architecture that, the architecture doesn't describe Black culture. It doesn't empower us. It doesn't speak to us. It doesn't, and that's in most Black neighborhoods in America. So maybe art does, the art on the building, but to think of an actual aesthetic, I would say it has to be, Black culture has to be the first thought, in every kind of move that is made design concept wise. And my experience with it, I haven't experienced real Black architecture at like a personal scale, which is like a residential scale. I think there's been like a museum that I felt that from, but other than that, I haven't had much of an experience with it in person. And that was, of course, my big kind of study, my thesis, and et cetera. So I'll let somebody else take a stab at that.
Okay. So my opinion, I'm of the opinion that it's like, this is a very hard sort of question or thing to define because it has no limits. Just like Black people are not all the same, we are not like one characteristic. We are very similar in how we are, but we're not all the same. So to try to define us using one thing or one characteristic, so saying if you put these or if you paint the building or whatever, I think that's very narrow. So my understanding, it's sort of twofold. The first thing is that we, back in the day, in sort of like the 1800s or Shaga's day, or I'll use that the African context, in the days of King Shaga, how the houses and how architecture looked without the interference or the influence of the Europeans was exactly that. It was built by Black people, and they built structures and forms and spaces that sort of catered for their everyday life. So where they positioned the cooking areas, where the men and women would be allocated in terms of the space in the home, how you enter the home, all of those things were sort of determined by the time and the day in which they were living in. So they lived in an area, Shaga, the Zulu hut or the Zulu rondovel. When you enter that hut, for example, you have to bend down so that you become, if someone's inside and you're attacking them, you become less of a risk to the occupants inside, because you have to sort of humble yourself and you can't come in as an attacker to attack the family or the home. So certain nuances and certain sort of elements like that had a purpose in that day and time. And right now, being 2020 and us being the new age of architects, or the new group of architects who have lived in a westernized world all our lives. So it's kind of, it would be kind of very redundant or not very smart to try go emulate everything that happened in that day, because we are no longer in that time and in that day. But we still have characteristics as Black people, whether it's Black people in South Africa, Black people in Nigeria, America. There's certain ways in which we live and in which we interact with each other, just as family, as friends, as neighbors, which is it's an inclusive community. So we talk to our neighbors, for instance. In your block, you sort of know someone's mom who lives across the road. They can discipline your child, and you can discipline my child. So our kids play in the street, and one parent can stand on the stoop and look after all the kids in that neighborhood. So we live in a very inclusive neighborhood and inclusive society, which means that our parenting and our just like our family structures interact differently. So when you start designing to those characteristics or to those needs, then we are sort of creating a purely African it's not an aesthetic per se, but it's an African architecture, because the space that we're creating caters to how we interact with each other, how we interact with our neighbors. We as Africans, I don't know about America, but I'm sure that the neighbors interact with each other, you know each other, and we are not the society that to come in your home and lock yourself up and never see your neighbor and only drive out once when you get to the shop. Our kids sit outside and play in the streets. Your neighbor knows what's happening with the lady next door, the parents up the street, so those kinds of spaces is what would define our architecture today, and it would be less about what it looks like, but how we communicate, how we use the spaces, and how it sort of characterizes us as a people and us living together. That I think would be the best way to approach it, to try find that aesthetic. I don't know if it'll be an aesthetic anyway. Materials are materials. It's space creation, I suppose. Yeah.
I definitely agree with a lot of your points. And I think here, we're dealing with gentrification at rapid rates in majority of our historically predominantly Black neighborhoods and communities and cities. So when I think of the importance of aesthetics, even, I think of like the area I'm working in now, Watts. Watts was over 80% Black 30 years ago. And then 8 years ago, it was down to 24% Black. And today it's down to 16% Black. And you think of, okay, when people leave Watts, what do they come back to? And what do they have a reason to come back? Are buildings getting better? Are they getting, is there something that is going to speak to them and their history and Black history here through the built environment? Because these kind of huge Eurocentric designs that will come are typically the signs or the end signs of displacement. And so it kind of is like displacement has an aesthetic almost. These Eurocentric towers and these kind of, even where they place these same exact apartment units just all over a city now, where there's 15 of them, but they are not for us. And I feel like when you're in an environment and you feel that everywhere I'm in LA, so you can go to Chinatown, you can go to Thai Town, you can go to all these, you can go to East LA, you can go to Boyle Heights, and you can go to everywhere where the built environment sort of speaks to the culture of everybody around it. So I do think that it's very important for the built environment to speak to Black culture as well, because the difference is when you're going into our neighborhoods, which you're really not going to do if you're not from there. If you're not Black or brown, you're rarely going to go into a Black or brown neighborhood. And there's reasons why. The built environment is one. I just think that we need to be empowered through it. I think that it sort of ends to, if your built environment is made of graffiti, your homes are old, there's abandoned buildings, they don't pick up your trash as often. It's not nice. I think that ends up having an effect on both self-perception and perception from the outer world in a sense. So I think that our architecture really needs to speak to raising our self-perception and perception from people who come into our neighborhood.
This this is a beautiful conversation. I could just sit here and listen to y'all. Really hard to step in at this point. No, they're stealing all my answers. But I think Ian Pei puts it best when he says that architecture is the very mirror of life. I think the Black aesthetic to me, or Black architecture to me, is an architecture that represents or that mirrors a life that I haven't lived yet. A life where I'm valued, a life where my history is valued, a life where my people and our contributions are valued. You see, when you look at Gothic architecture and how it's structured, there's a particular story and a history, and the sharp points pointing to God, and this is a particular time within medieval history and the Jesuits, etc. And then when you look at buildings that you see in places like South Africa or Kenya, they're called the colonial buildings, right? So every time I see those buildings, they remind me of the pain that my ancestors went through. And those are the buildings I have to use every day. Those are the structures I have to design sometimes every day, because even our clients and our people, right, we're so colonized and conditioned to see that as better than anything that represents us. So I want architecture that represents a life that I haven't lived yet. I want architecture that represents the value of my people, my culture, peace, love, growth. So that's what I see as a Black aesthetic. I think Churchill puts it best when he says that we shape our buildings thereafter they shape us, right? So for far too long, the buildings have been shaped by white people as white spaces, both in Africa and abroad. And often this, that's why we call them the colonial buildings, right? The Edwardian buildings, right? So all of these things are actually triggers to me and to us about how we were oppressed and how we continue to live under the shadow of that oppression. How do we flip the script? How do we draw from our culture, as Dr. was saying? How do we draw from our aesthetics, as Demar was saying, and create an architecture that mirrors our value?
Oof. Y'all ain't have to kill us like that for the first question, man. I think those responses were so dope. And I think a lot of what I was hearing, particularly from you, Demar, is the importance of architecture reflecting our culture and how it impacts our sense of identity. So I really want to ask you guys, do you see your cultural identity reflected in the built environment having an impact on your of your sense of self, and how so?
Yes, I do. Say right now, this apartment I'm in is in Koreatown. And when I walk outside, it feels like it's Koreatown, and even when I move, like right now I'm in the process of moving, and it's like I only had a few options, to be able to go somewhere that I'm gonna feel like I will, for one of the first times that I will be in an area that I feel accurately kind of represents me, because it's in Leimert Park, and there's so much culture there. And I think right now I will go and, I think we've all played Spot the Black Person, and I'm in Koreatown, like, yo, because I need, I don't know, like seeing another Black person sometimes rejuvenates me, because when you're like just out here, most of my meetings, a lot of my meetings, when I'm speaking with the developer or speaking with even a lot of clients that I have, it's not us. And I feel like if that home doesn't give you that rejuvenation, it's tough. And I could say that speaking firsthand. So I really do think that it's important to have, to see your cultural identity reflected. So you feel seen and you feel a part of something, and not isolated in your community in a sense.
Ooh, it's a good one. It's a good one. I think I'll start it back with that quote from Churchill that I mentioned in the first question, this idea that we shape our buildings thereafter they shape us, right? So for me, I think one person once described the term African American in this way. It says, well, it's African where we're coming from, hyphen American, where we live right now is American. And then the hyphen in between means the space, the void, the history, the culture that we've lost over time, right? The unknown. So currently in the space that I live in within architecture, when I go to sort of like rural areas within South Africa, I see the history of my forefathers and how they lived, and I see myself in there, right? But when I look at the world that I live in, this is the world that I'm present in, so I can relate to it, but it doesn't define who I am. So a lot of how I see space right now is within that void, where I feel like there's a missing element within aesthetic and within architecture that represents me. So that's how I see it right now. And why is this important? I think I think architecture and aesthetics is fundamentally important because architecture is a tool that is never neutral, right? It either enhances or suppresses. And we've seen that with apartheid architecture, we've seen that with redlining, and we continue to see the impacts of that some 40, 50, 60, and 70 years post that having been, designed into place. So that's my thoughts on that.
Yeah, I think both those points were really great points, and I think I'll just tap into both of them in the sense that when you see yourself in your own cultural identity in spaces around you, you feel like you belong. So it does give you a sense of pride. It gives you a sense of belonging. It gives you a sense of, oh, I've also contributed in my own community, contributed in the spaces that I live, and I am valuable because I can add value in the spaces that we live in. So I think it's what Demar was saying is really great, that you can walk from one neighborhood and feel sort of out of place and feel sort of you're not comfortable there because you realize that, oh, this is not me and I'm being looked at as the outsider. But once you get into a space where you can identify yourself, you can identify your history, whatever that is that may represent a part of you or where you come from, then you start to feel like home and you start to contribute. On what Wandile was saying is that we do live in a sort of a weird capsule. So I've never lived in America. I lived in South Africa, and in South Africa, apartheid, where I grew up in a township, and when you go from a suburb to a township, you can see exactly that. Okay, this is a suburb now. This is a township, and the architecture is different. Apart from it being sort of maybe not as fancy or as stylish as the houses that you'll find in the suburbs, there's this element of aspirations that South Africans or Africans have that live in the township. Yes, they might have started with a 4-room house that was only like 40 square meters, and they had the mother, the grandmother, and a whole bunch of people living there. But as an illustration or as a demonstration of progress and evolution and the generations that have come, each son, when, let's say, my mother, for instance, the house that she grew up in was literally 40 square meter house in the township of Vermont. All of the houses looked the same. The street was dusty. We had no paving. We had no fences. It was what it was. Over time, she worked. She was a teacher. Her and her sisters were able to get a bit more money, and then they extended the house. They added 2 more rooms. The brother or the uncle started working, and he added a garage. So now the architecture is changing, and this is something that they are adding on themselves. It wasn't a structure that was given to them. Yes, they got given a subpar structure, but they have developed it. And in each of these additions, they're adding their own character. It's also making a statement about who they are. Oh, now we are educated. We're the generation that's educated. Now here I come, I'm the next generation, I'm actually an architect, and I look at the structure and I'm like, oh no, that's not good enough. This is what it's actually supposed to look like, right? So I think my thing is always the fact that we must also be cognizant of now and who the aspirations that the Africans of today have. And we are not necessarily caught up in trying to re-illustrate what we used to be and what, where we come from. Yes, that is part of our culture. That's part of our culture and it's something that we carry on and we live with on a day-to-day basis. By all means, illustrate that and show that in your design, show that in your home, by what you wear and how you represent yourself in the world. But we mustn't think that Africans are always trying to go back. We are progressive human beings, and I think even without European interference, we would have developed the way we look at our aesthetic as well to a certain degree. I don't know what that looks like currently, but I think it's reflective of how we are and how we live today. So I think it's really nice to drive through my township, the same township my mother grew up in, to drive through it now and have it looking totally different, because now it has become the identity of the people that live there and the kids and the generations and what they deem to be aesthetically pleasing, what they deem to be beautiful. Yes, some of it I might not agree with, and I'm just like, what is this monstrosity down the corner, you know? But that's how that person wants to be identified, and they're proud of who they are. Yeah, so that's my perspective.
I think that was so great. What I heard was when Demar said spot the Black person, I live that experience as well, especially when I travel internationally. Like I studied abroad in grad school in Tokyo, Japan, but I didn't live in like the heart of Tokyo. I lived on the outskirts, and it was very, very Japanese as expected. And there was this one Black guy who we passed by each other every day on our commutes to and from school and work. And every day it was, and it's just a notification of like, I see you. And if I don't see you tomorrow, I'll be worried. So make sure we have that same community, because there's not a lot of us out here. So I think that's so important. And Wandale, I heard you say architecture is never neutral. And we talk about this a lot at Design in Color, that, you know, we are raised up in this education system that thinks that architecture is, you know, ahistorical and apolitical, and it's just a building. It doesn't have feelings. But we don't realize how our surroundings affect how we navigate the world and how we think of ourselves, right? And Nantokozo, I am a Jamaican immigrant to this country. So when I go back home, it's the same system of, as the family grows and attains jobs and money, we add on rooms, we add on a roof, we add on another layer. So seeing the generational buildup of a structure, I think is so important to remember of our history, because I think oftentimes we think of, you know, it has to be this final product, but the construction always seems to develop. So I think you all made phenomenal points. Switching gears a little bit, when we reflect on at least American culture in terms of like hip hop and reggae music, which was an important foundation for early, you know, hip hop, it has played a vital role in creating vivid narrations of the physical conditions and generational trauma of Black people that they've had to triumph for survival, essentially. So whether the lyrics are talking about the brutality of police, poverty, gentrification, Black people in America have had to recontextualize urban spaces with the survival tactics of an Afrofuturist, essentially. So how can restorative healing be an integral part of how communities gather and develop trust with, you know, architecture and our built environment?
I like to go first because they speak better than me. Okay, so I think with, let me actually, can you put that question back in the chat so I make sure I see it? Thanks. When I think of hip hop, it's more like people are narrating the built environment on. And that starts with, I mean, the message. And it just goes all the way up until today. And I think when we think of like restorative healing, how you can kind of do it in my, I guess through my experience, is very small scale personally. So what we're trying to do is kind of have the community be able to actually put their hands on projects and actually be the ones who make the decisions, because typically communities, specifically Black communities, are brought projects that are figured out and say, hey, how about this? You know, and then kind of the community gets the option to change 6% or something of the, you know, but they don't actually get what they need, and it's not healing the community at all. So I think that, I don't know any Black people who trust developers. And since I'm a Black person now, I'm dealing with developers. I don't really trust it either. And, and I'm trying to, this is something that I'm trying to answer in my career. And I think so far what I've been doing is having very intimate meetings every time I do anything that is going to kind of, starting with Watts, and then we have these sort of pop-up parks that are coming. And it's like these bi-weekly meetings where it's just us on a porch in the front of the house. And, it's very intimate, and, we'll have a Zoom link if you need it, but it's different than being at a neighborhood council where they have some people who are speaking, almost intimidating, where other people don't feel comfortable to say anything and don't feel comfortable to say what they actually need. So I think kind of these ways are, I guess, just going away from just an RFI, and looking for, looking for the community to actually be a design partner in everything that is sort of placed in their neighborhood. I think that's the only way that trust can really be built, especially now the stakeholders in all these Black communities in LA and a lot in just in America are fighting everything because everything has been to their detriment so far. So I don't think that there's, of course, one Band-Aid fix to restore communities, but I think that if you listen to the community stakeholders and kind of able to actually kind of take a back seat in a sense as a designer to understand what they need and understand that it's not about us getting our shit off, and I think, that's kind of a step in the right direction.
Okay, I'll say, I think the best person to possibly answer this question will be Wendy. But before we get, just to add on Demar's point about having this community engagement, or the end users, the people who are actually going to be living in these spaces, being able to be part of the development committee and voicing their opinion about what they want, how it would help the community is very important. And I think that's where Mr. Mtian is an expert at that. But I want to say is that with the restorative places or healing, you'll find that in our communities, especially in the townships of South Africa, if you're trying to rehabilitate, because I think Opalia had mentioned earlier about if we're trying to reintegrate people who have been incarcerated before and they come back to the community, where do they go? How do they fit into this space and the community? The one thing that you'll find, especially with the young Black men or young Black kids in the township, they get into a life of crime where they have to get sent away because they don't have any activity. They are not involved in any extramural activities per se that can keep them busy or keep them occupied, so that they don't have to resort to the things that they do that gets them sent away to prison and things like that. So what is very important is to cater for our youth, to create spaces that are catering to our youth, whether it's a community sports center, whether it's a library, whether it's something to do with technology and environment where they can learn how to build technology, programming, computers. There are an array of things that other communities have access to, which then means as a 12-year-old or a 13-year-old, he's already learning how to do programming, or he's already learning how to fix a cell phone, so on and so forth. I think with mainly East European countries or communities, you'll find that the father is an entrepreneur. He's got a little shop there, he's got a little laundromat, and the kids work in the shop and the laundromat, so they're already harnessing their business skills. So their time from a young child is being occupied or is being spent not in the streets running around looking at whatever gangster or thug of the area is, but they're actually working in their father's shop. They fixing a cell phone, fixing a computer, learning how to trade in a shop or whatever, whatever it is. So I think building those kinds of facilities in our communities is number one, very important. Being able to see Black-owned shops, Black-owned bakeries, laundromats, all of those things. That means that the kids in that neighborhood can see Mr. Mtiani or Mr. Mhlungu in the neighborhood. They know, oh, Mr. Mhlungu is wealthy or can live like this because he owns a bakery. His wife owns a jam making factory, and the daughter is a seamstress. And have to encourage, or us as architects would have to make sure that is provided, is catered for in our neighborhoods to be able to change that.
Awesome. And just to add on to these brilliant responses is, from what I see from the question, is like a couple of themes. That there's rehabilitation, there's resilience, and there's the adaptation. And as Black people, I think we are the kings of adaptive reuse and resilience, and turning lemon into lemonade. And I think I want to start by saying something that was very comforting when I was talking to one of my anthropologist mentors, who said, when we look at the African culture, for instance, the Black African culture, and sort of the Eurocentric world that we live in, even within Africa, from how we judge in courts to how the systems work within government, etc. It's like we are living in a system that inherently isn't us, right? That inherently also wasn't built for us, right? From law to everything, right? So when you look at the European system, it's tangible, it's cutthroat. You go to court, and one person is for this, the other person is against this. Someone is wrong, they're killed, or they go to jail because they're inherently wrong and they're evil based on that judge, right? Whilst within the African context, in the African community, it's very communal. There's this concept of Ubuntu, I am because we are, right? So even if you're wrong, I can still see myself in you, right? So just because you're wrong doesn't mean now you deserve to die, right? How can we help you get closer to where we are? And clearly there's something wrong with the circumstances that have led you to this particular decision, and maybe the way you're thinking. How can we get the elders to sit down with you and have a conversation with you and help you realize otherwise, right? So we live in a system that's oppressive, and also it just isn't built for us. And I just want to say this to all of us: give yourself grace, because we're living in a world that is inherently not ours, or that has been shaped against us. So I think that's one in terms of like rehabilitation, and growing up in a township, some of the more dangerous neighborhoods. There's a lot of cats that I knew, like, oh, that guy's like a gangster, very reputed one too. And oh, that's my cousin who's also a gangster, or this, whatever. But what would happen is that these cats would, do their thing, get to jail, come back. But when they came back to the community, it was never like, hide your kids, They were still effective members of the community. And the go-go's, which are like the grandmas and the lady from next door, the parents, would talk to them. Because what they saw is they saw the 7-year-old who grew up running naked in front of them. And so they would talk to you like that, like, what's happening to you? Like, Mtana, my child, come here. They'll sit down with you. And so that effect of community, that effect of grace, which is not prevalent within the Western framework of things, I think that's very important. Now, in terms of adaptation, I put in a link here to a quote. I wrote an article on the word ghetto, 12-page article. I never thought I would get to use this information, so I'm excited to be here. So in the 18th century, this word was in the Italian dictionary, and the phrase was fare un ghetto, which means to make a ghetto. And the description that follows us when many together want to speak over each other, creating confusion like that of the Jews in their synagogue. So this was like deep anti-Semitism in Europe, right? So when we think of anti-Semitism, we just think of Germany. Like, no, Germany was just like the popping of the iceberg, but across Europe, folks are pretty anti-Semitic. So what they did was they would create these ghettos, these places, these enclosed spaces, with one gate in and one gate out, which is interesting because that's exactly what they did in South Africa in designing the Black neighborhoods and the townships. And they also had a curfew within these Jewish neighborhoods where after 6 p.m. no one comes out, and they open the gates at 6 a.m. so that these become laborers for the Western world, and then they go back to these crowded spaces, which were seen as dungeons and they were seen as filthy, etc. But now, interesting thing, back, a lot of Jews started migrating to the United States. And I think around the 1930s, 1940s there, and 1950s, the shift started to happen, right? So when they moved to the United States at first, they were sort of put in Jewish neighborhoods who were known as ghettos, right? But with the migration of African Americans from the South more into the North and different places, what started happening is that there was now a new lower, right? Like there was a new group of people who were going to be oppressed or looked down on more than the Jews. So what started happening is that term migrated from the Jews to us. That's why Black neighborhoods today are often seen as, oh, that's the ghetto. And it's sort of the time where Jews started going up and started being seen more as white than just this low income community. And but I say this to say what's interesting is how this word has sort of adapted, because when we got it, we made it cool, right? You started having ghetto fabulous, right? Kids in Beverly Hills now would walk out and say, I live in the ghetto, right? So it's interesting how we recycle all the negative that they throw to us and send it back to them, and they use it as cool, right? That's why they're trying to get that N word as well. But so I think as Black people, we really master the art of resilience and adaptation, and I think that needs to continue within the design and the built environment as we adapt to the world that really isn't built for us.
Just to add on to one of the early things that Wandale was saying, I think it's interesting that when someone would go to jail or anything like that, they will be able to come home and still have a community that's for them over there. I think that is like that in some places out here, because a lot of places are just, it's common, and sometimes you're even going to be celebrated, but you're more so celebrated by young people. You're not, your family isn't necessarily celebrating you doing a bid, and when you come home, depending on where you are, like, and I just say this speaking personally, like when I was like 21, I caught a case, right? And this when I was in undergrad. And so I was in Delaware, I'm from LA, or, and it's like, I come out, I'm like a junior, and there's nothing for me, and I'm like, yo, I just messed my life up. I have, and I'm just trying to figure this thing out. Like, there's not a community who is going to say, hey, we got you, don't worry about a job. Like, you still gonna get your degree, you good, and at the same time, when I was in the police station, the cops are literally saying to me, oh, you're effed. We're gonna say, we're gonna say you're a menace to society, all this wild stuff. This isn't even a violent crime. I'm like, what is happening? And so you can really just be kind of, I think if the restorative community can speak to, I don't know, I guess if the restorative community in America can be more like the one that you're speaking of in South Africa, then I think it would be life-changing for a lot of people. You even have people now who are coming home off of weed charges, which is a whole nother story, because and I was one of those people, and so it's tough to restore. I had to kind of figure that out myself, and I was always afraid to work at a firm, because I'm like, it's gonna come up, somebody gonna be like, no, and my future is now dictated by somebody else, and it's like, dang, for a mistake at 21 to have everybody else kind of be in power of my life after this, there was no restorative thing in place for me. I had to figure out how to restore. So I think that that's dope. I never even knew that, you know, for people to be able to go to elders once they get home and people put you right, like that's beautiful.
Or elders coming to you, like, yo, what's going on? You know what I mean? Yeah, I think that begins with us, right? We need to create that community as well. I think some of that is starting to get lost, or start to get lost with us as the younger generation being just more colonially minded. You know, this idea of like, you do you and I do me, you know what I mean? Just like hide away from others. And I think we need to start changing that within our own selves as young folks, and reaching out to the cats that, because the thing is, we grew up with these cats. You know what I mean? Like the cat that's going to jail, the cat that's committing a crime, the cat that's, when you go back to your community, are you approachable? Can that dude from the corner of the street that you used to play soccer with when you were 7 come and have a conversation with you? Can you go have a coffee with them? Or are you too brand new now? Starts with us. Starts with us creating that community and keeping those relationships. Because at the end of the day, we all we got.
For sure. I heard so many gems in this last question on restorative justice. And I think all of us, both us here in the US and everyone abroad in South Africa, we all have experiences of how architecture has been racialized to oppress us, right? And we all can, you know, have the experience of an architecture world that's reflective of this Eurocentric standard that we can then place our own Afrofuturistic elements on top of. But one thing that we are really big on here with design and color is this concept of sacred space, a space where you can essentially be safe and be your true self. And everyone's idea of sacred space is different and personal to them. When you think of your engagement with European-based architecture and the ways that it's been racialized, it's often a disruptor of Black people's sacred space. So my question to you all is, what is your definition of sacred space, and how do you see Black vernacular architecture amplifying it? And that will be our last question before we go into a Q&A. So for everyone watching, if you have questions, please drop them in the chat and we'll be sure to ask the panelists.
Can you actually, I guess I don't have a specific definition or list of sacred spaces. And I know that that's going to be different to everyone. I think that there are common ones that are very much shared here, like, you know, of course, barbershops and churches, and I think even liquor stores in a sense are very sacred because of how comfortable you can feel in a liquor store. You know, even, you know, sometimes Roscoe's feels like a sacred space. I don't know, there's a lot of Black spaces here that, you know, that should really have a vernacular that don't, like all those places that I list, like my HBCU is a sacred space. That architecture does not reflect, you know, our culture necessarily either. But I think that it could, and that's where I ultimately see Black architecture going. You know, starting at like this small residential scale, working itself through parks and through apartment homes and all the way up to shaping our colleges. And hopefully our students are the ones who are having a huge hand in the designing of their campus. And they will always be at that campus because that's their space. They helped build that. They help, you know, I think that if all of these spaces that we can kind of think fondly on, reminisce over, or have some sort of nostalgia over that meant something to us and our family and our friends. I think if those were to have a architectural language that would speak to that in some sense, speak to that being a sacred space for us would be beautiful and would be, I mean, that's what I see. That's definitely my goal for Black architecture and where I see Black aesthetics heading. Yeah, I'll let everybody else take a stab.
I think I.M.Pei puts it best when he says, again, architecture is a very mirror of life. You only have to cast your eyes on buildings to feel the presence of the past, the spirits of the place. They are a reflection of society. I think for me, the sacred spaces are the spaces where I don't have to think about architecture. I just speak. I just exist. And I think Demar put it best when he started mentioning some of those spaces, like church, right? Sometimes, or like the barber shop, or etc. So, but you know, as he said, he can mention like 3 typologies that I can relate to, right? Whilst other folks, it's like, you know, most buildings reflect those sacred spaces for them. I guess then the challenge for us is, how do we then start designing these spaces that are sacred to us? And how we do that is by designing the spaces for the things that we love and we do, and let's make who we are, and starting to give them a language and an understanding. So I just wanted to sort of add on to your point.
I think I agree with all the points that the gentlemen have raised thus far. The only thing I'd have to add is that just from a perspective of a young African woman living in South Africa, for me, having a sacred space would mean feeling safe wherever I am. And in South Africa, we have the scourge of crime particularly against women, and particularly against women of color, where anywhere for you is really not safe. So we sort of have to put a curfew on ourselves within our own neighborhoods. So it's not like I'm in another neighborhood and I might get robbed or attacked or just violated in any kind of way. It's even in my own neighborhood. So for me, apart from the spaces that they've mentioned, which are spaces that are buildings, that are physical spaces, I think just feeling safe in my neighborhood, knowing that if I'm walking down the street, going to the shop, or going to take a bus, I don't look at myself as a victim or a possible victim of rape, a possible victim of being attacked, or even just being, like catcalled by the construction worker down the road. I think for us females, we experience the world in such a different context than our male counterparts, where we are cognizant of how the world perceives us and how we ourselves show ourselves or portray ourselves to the world, because that might have consequences. So if I feel like I look nice dressed in a certain way, maybe I'm wearing a short dress, but I'm walking down the road, and now I've walked down the streets and I'm further away from my block with the young men who know me, or the fathers that may know me, I may be attacked. Now I'm no longer in my sacred space where I feel safe. In order for me to confidently walk down the street wearing that dress, I have to be in a certain zone where I know I'm going to see Demar, who knows me, or Demar's brother, or Wandila's brother, who you to protect me. So I think apart from just architecture, just our urbanscape and just how we construct our communities, it needs to take into cognizance not necessarily the surveillance, but the openness, or being able to look after each other as a community, being able to feel safe in all of those spaces, down the street, up the road, in the corner cafe, at church. So to be more about safety, and it'll be more about just belonging, as I mentioned before, being able to belong in that community, knowing that this is my neighborhood, I'm good here.